you guys, I know, followed it pretty closely and made recommendations, and we really appreciate your feedback. The night of, on the 19th, when we passed it, there were some changes, but not too significant. Basically, the mayor's budget, as proposed, passed. He incorporated a lot of the suggested changes into an S version, so there weren't a ton of amendments on the floor, although there were some. One of the most prominent that got some media attention was the $2.4 million proposed unallocated cut that would have gone to cold weather sheltering proposed by Ms. Zelatel. There were, as you can imagine, there were negotiations and discussions over the weekend. She proposed it on a Friday. We voted on a Tuesday. Over that weekend, there was a lot of discussions, all in compliance with the Open Meetings Act, through the mayor's office, and eventually that amendment was reduced down to $700,000. The mayor, I'm not sure if OMB plans to do a presentation on this as well, so I don't want to step on too much.
Nope, you go right ahead. Thank you.
OMB had revised projections over that weekend that they believed they were going to have additional revenue, so that was where a lot of the $700,000 came from. There were some small cuts, but not too much. There was another source of funds, which I'll talk about at the end of my presentation. But to quickly highlight some other amendments, we passed additional funding for a raise for the assembly aides who get paid $1,000 a month, and so we wanted to increase that amount so perhaps we could get closer to a sort of real or even a part-time job for our aides. We also increased funding for the election to hire an election coordinator. Myself and Mr. Rivera sponsored a $250,000 amendment that passed that created a competitive grant to be run by the health department that will go to children with high ACEs scores. ACEs, you probably are all familiar with it, but it's a measure of adverse childhood experiences. And it was going to go to the United Way directly, but our colleagues felt it would be better to go to a competitive grant process, which is what it will do. And it's to have youth with high ACEs scores improve their educational outcomes, so particularly graduation rates. So that did pass. So the other kind of, I think, interesting item for this body, and something that might come back next year, is the trust fund payout. So if the MLP sale goes through, and because we passed that stipulation with Providence, we will go through. I mean, it's possible that it doesn't. If it doesn't go through, there's going to be serious problems with the municipal budget, because the mayor had already built in an assumption that about $3 million was going to come, $3.5 million was going to come from the trust fund payout. And to get that level of trust fund payout, we would have to take the majority of the funding that results from the MLP sale after the debt of the MLP has been retired and the other portions of the stipulation, like the $36 million for ratepayers, has been satisfied. It leaves about $230 to $234, I think, $234 million. And there's debate about what exactly we should do with that. Now, the ballot initiative that passed said we could either put it in the trust fund or pay off debt. And we have gone back and forth with the administration trying to figure out what kinds of debts we have and at what interest rates. And the truth is, the municipality has very little, basically no high interest debt anymore. We've done a good job of paying that off or sort of refinancing it in interesting ways. So now most of our debt payments have very low interest rates. On the flip side, the municipal trust has been paying out between, or has been earning between, I think, 6 and 8%. And again, the OMB, please correct me if I'm getting these numbers wrong, between 6 and 8% per year over the last 10 years, or I should say the last 5 years. And so the municipal trust has been performing well, and so it makes more sense to take that money and put it into the corpus of the trust fund that was created with the sale of the telephone utility back in the 1990s. Now, during the financial crisis, in 2008, the assembly passed an ordinance that said we were getting, I think, 5%. Yeah, we were getting 5% per year as a payout from the trust, and we dropped it to 4.25% until the trust had, quote, recovered. Well, once we drop $234 million into the trust, it will have recovered. It will be more than twice the value it had even before the financial crisis. So the ordinance is written in such a way that the trust fund payment automatically goes from 4.25 back to 5%. And so the administration, when they proposed their original budget, hadn't taken that into account. And so myself and some other assembly members said, hey, this is an additional about $500,000 because we're going to go from 4.25 to 5%. So the administration agreed, and that $500,000 went, half of it went to the Zolotel amendment, and half of it went to restore the bus route to the library that goes down the old Seward Highway. Now I think, so to further complicate matters, we will only be getting half a year's worth of trust fund payments if everything goes according to plan. That is, of the elevated amount, because we're not going to actually be able to deposit the money from the MLP sale until the middle of next year, probably. Then in 2021, we'll get a full payment, so it will be significantly more money. And I think there's going to be a move, and I probably will introduce this ordinance. I actually had the ordinance drafted up and ready to go to return that 5% payout back to 4.25 or 4.5% to be more conservative with the fund. We'll still be getting a much larger payment because we'll have a much larger corpus. But in discussions with Alex Slupka, the CFO, I think he is more comfortable with it being in the 4s rather than at 5. But for the remainder of 2020, we're going to allow the 5% payout for that 6 months or so.
Oh, sorry, through the chair. I assume it's earning some type of interest. Do you know what rate of interest it's earning?
Yeah, so it's earning between 6 and 8%.
Oh, you said that.
Yeah, it's been earning.
Yes, you did say that. Okay.
Yeah, it's been earning between 6 and 8%. It's been paying out at 4.25.
Right. Yeah. Sorry about that, Forrest. I
No.
do recall you saying that.
So yeah, that's sort of what happened. There were, like I said, a bunch of other little amendments, but those were kind of the top line items.
Yeah, well. The second question is it by ordinance that that money can only be used for the two things you said, the high interest loans and what was the second thing?
Deposit to the trust.
Okay, so if that's the case, is it legal for us to use it for these bill introductions or these MEGs?
Yes, absolutely.
Proposal?
Absolutely, because we're not using the principal of the sale. We're using the interest that comes off of the trust. Okay. So when we went to the people of Anchorage, we said we're going to put it in the trust. The trust generates income that has been generating income forever. So yes, we're not.
There's no guidelines on that income and how it can be used.
That's right. It just goes into the general fund.
Okay.
Outside the cap.
It's actually outside the cap. So it's very useful money.
It's the most valuable money you have if it's outside the cap, right?
Outside the cap and also colorless, if that makes sense.
Unrestricted.
Yeah, it's not tied to like a fire service area or the road service area. We can do basically anything that's legal with it, and so it's very useful money.
Mr. Dunbar, also another item that went through an amendment was concerning the Academy Vanguard DOT project, where there was going to be capital money from the muni in order to make the state portion of the project work out together.
I mean, I could spend half an hour talking about this, but I'll keep it very short. Do you want me to explain?
Right.
Okay, so they had asked us to put $4 million on the bond as sort of a down payment on a $20 million project that we don't need and don't want. We're only doing it because the state is building a project and won't stop. And so the project to connect, to run Skipper and 92nd underneath the highway and dump 10,000 cars into this neighborhood, Independence Park, that very much does not want this to happen. So I am still hopeful that our legislature will intervene and stop this project from going forward. So I was not comfortable with us moving forward with this in a significant way with this $20 million bond project, which is like 10% of our total bonding capacity per year. It's a huge, I mean, to give you a sense of the scale, the Spenard Road, which has been massively beneficial, was $25 million. So, I mean, it was a huge project. But at the same time, there are people in the way of that. We had to do right-of-way acquisition, and there was a building in the way that was owned by Christian Health Associates, and they've been in limbo for years. And so they were begging us, like, they're like, we don't care what you do with this road, but we can't be in limbo. We want to move buildings and get a new lease. And so we included $1.5 million on the bond to basically purchase that building. We already had $3 million from a previous bond to purchase that building because right-of-way acquisition. So I reduced, it was my amendment, we reduced the amount from $4 million down to 1.5. We took the remaining 2.5 million, and actually added another 500,000 for two other more worthy road projects, one in Spinard, one repaving 15th, parts of 15th. And then we took that $1.5 million, we're going to buy that building, and we're going to let Christian Health Associates leave. And then the good thing about that is it's actually a pretty nice building. So if the road goes through, we will unfortunately have to knock down that building, which is one of the reasons this road is so stupid. But if we stop the project, we don't have to we have this building, we can do something with it. We could sell it, we could lease it, we could turn it into a municipal facility. That's what happened.
So, yeah, it kind of highlights an interesting disconnect between the state and the union as well.
So, Mr. Chairman,
Yeah.
just to provide you extra color, that just so before I speak, I want to make sure this is good. This is essentially the Scooter Ave extension, right?
Yes.
Okay. So when the state went in and they built that Scooter Ave off ramp, if you ever go down that off ramp, you'll notice that to the south of that off ramp there is a mobile home park. Most of those mobile homes they're not on AWWU, so they were on wells. And when the state went in, it actually damaged the aquifer in that area, and so those homes were no longer getting clean water. So the 1 year that I worked as a legislative finance aide, that was the district that was in the district, and not only did it damage the aquifer, but because of the way they constructed the road and the fact that they didn't attach those homes at the time they constructed the road, it took the cost of attaching those homes to AWWU from like $10,000 a unit to $50,000 a unit. So the state damaged the source of water and then essentially quintupled the cost of attaching those units onto the road. And when it was brought to DOT's attention, they're like, not our problem. It took a whole legislative session to essentially like negotiate, well, we'll come up with $250,000 to do X, and you, DOT, need to come up with some money to do X. So that project has been, it has been, I mean, hey, that's a great off-ramp to have and all that sort of stuff, but it has been a problem project in more ways than one. And so the last comment that was made that this, it's just an example that you made actually, that this is an example of the interplay between the city and the muni, between the muni and the state, is that this has been a bad project for the muni kind of from the get-go, where the state just doesn't care.
Have somebody already presented to this body about that project?
No, Alyssa and I have attended some of the work sessions, though, and the DOT person, I remember Baskey, I can't remember his first name, Sean Baskey, did say pretty bluntly that this project was happening whether you like it or not.
He said it was a juggernaut that you can't stop. And
Yeah.
that was like waving a red flag in front of us. So I've
Yeah.
started to contact legislators, and I mean, they're going to waste. I mean, it is a waste because the traffic patterns have changed in the area. The traffic problems in Diamond are no longer nearly as significant for a variety of reasons. We have the Lower Road underpass, and we've done things. They're going to spend $100 million on this project.
Well, you should make sure you're talking to Senator Von Imhoff's office, because they spent an entire legislative session putting up with that crap, and I'm sure that they would love to carry some water to, one, it gets rid of waste, two, they've already seen the damage that project has done, and they have to put up with it because it's in the district. So if you need an introduction to Shireen or Natasha, let me know.
Thank you. It also destroys a beloved soccer field on the other side, for what it's worth. It's just an all-around crappy project. So, anyway.
Other thoughts from the assembly perspective before we move on? One thing also is on the Zalatel amendment. I had an op-ed that was in the ADN a couple of days ago that was talking about that and the difficulty of basically trimming all other departments in order to accommodate that 2.4 million, or the original amount, and how difficult that would have been. And so if you did want to check that out, I had a lot of help from the Lance and the administration in doing some of the analysis and stuff like that. So.
Yeah, I mean, like as one example, we were going to add $250,000 for that new bus route, and then her amendment would have cut like $210,000 from the exact same department, so we would have gotten rid of the bus route.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
Yeah.
With that, then, Mr. Ratliff, I think it's all your show.
Thank you. Everyone get a copy of our memos?
Looks like we did.
So there's two memos that I've passed out, and the slideshow is going to be a summary of the pro forma budget memo. Our pro forma budget memo generally just describes what it's going to cost to provide the same level of service that we are this year, next year, taking into account changes in number of students, demographics, and then whatever contracts and inflationary changes we have. So we just kind of outlined some salient factors of why our budgets are increasing to provide the same level of service, and we'll go through our revenue projections, see how much money we're getting from the state and city, the preliminary stuff, and then that really just creates our budget gap that we anticipate closing here in the next couple months before we submit our budget to the school board and then on to the assembly. Then we'll do the same thing for our transportation fund, and then probably discuss a little bit on our debt service fund too, as that's going to be another elephant in the room where the state's cut our bond debt reimbursement for the current year, and we're going to have to go back and try to make up those contributions in the subsequent tax year. Truth be told, it's the first time looking at this slideshow. My boss did it. He didn't show up. I'm here.
This will help you work out the kinks thing.
Right. So the purpose, yep, I guess we went through that. Good review our foundation formula, how the state pays and how money is generated to us. The district really has no method for raising its own funds. It's essentially a beggar of funds and beholden to all sorts of statute and Unicode. We start out with our adjusted average daily membership, which is how many kids are enrolled, and depending on the number of classes, not necessarily enrollment, but depending on the number of classes they're taking. Some kids might be going half time, so you only get half FTE for that, or ADM. So we take our average, our ADM, and there's a school size adjustment. It's kind of a curve where you get a lot more money for smaller schools than you do for bigger schools. So further out you get, more kids you get, the less money you get per student. But we get an additional, 5,000 or so ADM on top of that. District cost factor is a location differential. Anchorage School District is a 1. Everybody else gets more money than us on the district cost factor because when this was originally done in 2005-ish, it was determined that Anchorage was the cheapest place to live, and they haven't updated it since. Not in any meaningful fashion. I think they've done a couple studies, but nothing that's actually changed the foundation formula. So Anchorage School District, we are the 1. We have a couple of board members who are asking for that to be reviewed. I think Mr. Trainey, when he was doing some of the stuff, he allocated some money actually to try to get a grant for the state to actually go in and redo this study, but it really never went anywhere. So we don't get anything for disc cost factor. Special needs factor is an additional 20% on top of that ADM. So 20% and 1.5% for CTE, which is career technical education. And then we get intensive needs money for all the students that meet, I think it's 6 or 7 criteria to be considered intensive needs, including dedicated busing and a different array of services. And we get 13 times their ADM. And that's one thing that's really been growing in the last several years is our ADM counts have gone up by, I think, 82 this year from last year. And that's from about 950 students to a little over 1,030. So we've had really kind of leaps and bounds, and a lot of those students are actually kindergarten students, preschool students that we've identified as special needs. And I think a lot of that's coming down more to how we've done a better job identifying these kids that need the services and getting them into the pre-K classes as special needs. So hopefully we can get them moved on to their kindergarten classes.
Can I ask a question real quick?
Sure.
Do you have the data to see if the earlier the kids are identified as intensive needs and get that particular service, do they move out of intensive need? Is that something that you have the data to look at?
I don't know about the intensive needs, because most of the time, once they're identified as intensive needs, they continue to be intensive needs just because of the severity of their disability. But a lot of times, if they're identified as special education without intensive needs, then you do see some movement if you're offering pre-K into kindergarten, because a lot of the times it's just like a speech or a language thing that's identifying him. If the kid's not talking until he's 3 or something, then they qualify that as a disability. I had a kid, he didn't really talk until he was 3 because he could point and say nummy at whatever he wanted to eat and give it to him, right? And that's really all I needed. And he went to preschool and he picked up his language and he's fine now, but yeah, he didn't start talking because he was really just hungry and he knew how to get food. So, but yeah, we do see a marked increase in if you do preschool students for those students that are identified as special education early on, that they can move out at an earlier pace.
And did you say that just the identification of intensive needs kids has increased, or special and intensive?
It's both,
Okay.
right? And but the funding comes from the intensive needs funding. The increase in those students is particularly high among the preschool students.
Are your, is that evenly distributed across the geography of the district, or is that concentrated within the bowl?
That is a good question that I don't know the answer to.
Thanks.
We can look at that and see if we can get some. Yeah, I don't.
You may get a data request from me at.
Yeah, let me know. Let's send that on. I'm sure we have the data somewhere, or someone has it, but it's not. We have mostly looked at our aggregate numbers for the purposes of this
Okay.
stuff. Then the last step, we have correspondence money for all the students that are in correspondence, the homeschool programs. We get 90% of a ADM for them. And I think we have 2 charter schools and 1 district school that operates as correspondence. Kind of starting out, here's our projected kind of a structural deficit where we assume our inflation goes up by about 2% annually, and then our revenue projections down in green at the bottom. So up front, this year, for FY21 next year, we're looking at about a $20 million gap. And we'll kind of go through about how we get there. Our revenue is pretty much just the foundation formula and numbers, how it adds. We're projecting about 300 fewer ADM initially. We're waiting to get our final projections from our demographer. It may come back a little different than this, but I think we're within the 300 to 400 or 300 to 400 ADM range for that. As a reference in dollars, we get about $10,000 per ADM between state and local funding. So we anticipate going down about 300 students per ADM, and then down the SPED intensive increasing about 30. And that may go up depending on how many we can identify this spring that are going to be increasing. So we get to a district adjusted ADM at the bottom of about what we had preliminarily for our OASIS count this year. Our OASIS count was above what it was last year. We had about 95 or so more students than we had projected, which was good. We projected a loss of about 580 students, and we ended up with about 495 or 485. And then 82 more intensive students. So our projection for next year is pretty close in terms of state dollars to what it was, what we're actually going to receive this year. The rest of the calculation, so the adjusted ADM times the BSA creates a basic need. And that's kind of the basis for what the state pays out on. They take a required local effort of property taxes out. Our required local effort is going to go up quite a bit, $1.5 million or so for next year. And that's due to the value of the property in the Anchorage Bowl going up. So as that property goes up, it's 2.65 mils, and it's a dollar for dollar reduction in state revenue as the district's required contribution goes up. They take a portion of our federal impact aid money, which is the money we get for students living on base predominantly. It's generated because we can't tax that property, so the federal government gives us the money. The state actually takes about half of what's eligible, which is the non-special education and facilities funds. So because we have a disparity test in the state where based on the amount per student per adjusted ADM is within like a 25% range, they can deduct the federal money. I think Kansas is the only other state that does that. But it's about, if they didn't do that, then the state deducts about $100 million from districts statewide in impact aid. So it's a pretty big amount of money for them. Quality schools is $16 per adjusted ADM that we get. It's not a whole lot of money. And then the operating grant outside the BSA, that $8.4 million that was what was in HB 287 that provided one-time funds for last year and this year, and the state is currently suing itself about whether that's illegal to appropriate that money or not. So we're still not even sure if we'll get it for this year, but right now we know it's not in statute for next year, so we don't have it in there. The district has an additional local contribution, which is 23% of the basic need, plus the quality schools grant, plus any operating grants outside the BSA. So we anticipate the additional going down a little bit, predominantly because of that $8.4 million going away. Is there any question about this long, complex slide? Yeah, if you think of some later, you can always ask. So here's what our revenue looks like for next year. Our preliminary look at it. About $1.2 million in local taxes, which is kind of the net of about $1.6 million being shifted to the district based on the required local contribution going up, and then some money going away based on that $8.4 million local money going down. So the net's about a $1.2 million increase. We don't take into account any uses of fund balance in here. We let the board go just to say, here's the revenues we're actually getting. If you want to use some savings, we can. So our actual cuts may not be $20 million. The board may come back and decide to use fund balance to offset some of those cuts as they've done in previous years. For the current year, we used $5 million. So we anticipate having some money to put towards it, but we really don't know. We're not to the point where we know how much yet. Our E-rate is going down. That revenue is generated by the federal program where they reimburse us for the cost of bandwidth at about 60% of what we pay in. So if we pay $1 million in bandwidth and telephone charges, we get about $600,000 back. The reason it's going down, it was $1.5 million in FY20. $500,000 of that was due to a one-time agreement we had with the E-rate because we bought a bunch of hardware for our wireless endpoint connections, and they reimbursed that. And we did and this was several years ago, but we had to go back and make some appeals, and we finally got paid for it this year. And then we negotiated a better contract with ACS, lowering our costs or lower reimbursement for the subsequent year. Interest earnings continue to go up as the economy down south has done well, so is the municipal investment pool. So we're just trying to catch up to that. The foundation funding, the additional money, is the net result of increase in intensive needs students, the decline in regular ADM, and the cost shifting to property taxes. So overall, the increase in the intensive needs students really provides a lot of extra revenue to the district. But we are planning on losing $8.4 million. And then a reduction in federal impact aid is generally just based on the number of students that we have on base. It's declined a little bit, so we anticipate that going down as well.
Andy, the $8.4 million, that was generally just operating funds. It wasn't tied to a specific purpose for the district.
Right, it was counted just the same as foundation funding money for that purpose. So you could really kind of spend it however you want it.
Oh, yeah.
Within reason.
So I was just curious, do you know what the current fund balance is, and then how much can the board allocate each year without eating into the fund?
So the board has a policy that we maintain between 8 and 10% of undesignated fund balance, 8 and 10% of expenditures, I guess, is the calculation. So if we spend $600 million a year, we can reserve up to $60 million of undesignated fund balance, which would be our unassigned fund balance, the $25 million that we keep in reserve to maintain our bond debt, and then any money we put towards next year. So our ending fund balance last year we were right up close to the 10% initially, so we had like $30 million in unassigned fund balance, $25 million in money that's restricted for debt to keep our AAA bond rating, and then $5 million that we plan to use for the current year. We got our opinion back from our auditor, I guess it was Tuesday, or I guess last Wednesday before Thanksgiving. We had put in a receivable for some FEMA money that we were expecting to get based on the amount we spent for that recovery. The auditors came back and said, no, you can't recognize it this period. So our our unrestricted went from like 30 million down to 23. So we took out like $6.5 million of revenue that we anticipate getting this year. So we think it's going to be a wash, and that's just because we didn't have a signed grant agreement with FEMA at the time by the end of the fiscal year. So we made all those adjustments and got our opinion letter the next Tuesday, and but we do anticipate getting that money. So if you see our $23 million unassigned fund balance doesn't match what I told you of 30, it's because we took it out at the very end. We anticipate it going right back up as soon as we get our FEMA reimbursements. Fingers crossed. So that's really our revenue picture for our general fund. Our expenditures are based on, we've adjusted, for the purpose of this, adjusted it for enrollment, which is taking out FTE for, as we produce 300 ADM in the classroom, we take it's equated to about 13 teachers. The increase in intensive needs students, we've added 23 or so FTE to accommodate that. And then we added a couple FTE for in our admin to account for the board's new policy that any project over $100,000, we have to have at least 15% apprentices on the job. So the district has a burden of monitoring that now, and so we've added a couple folks in our purchasing and capital planning departments to be able to monitor, to make sure that all our contractors have all these apprentices that the board says we need to have now. So that's we can go over that topic later if you want. There's mixed feelings. We'll talk about our FTE, our salaries and wages, how those are increasing. Most of it are subs, bonuses, and all our benefit rates, and then some of the salary drivers that we have for our supplies and services. This is a picture of the FTE. We have a decrease in the instruction. That's where general teachers are. The increase in special ed and special ed support. And then the increase in down at function 550 is where you see the administrative folks to account for that apprenticeship policy. This is the salary inflation that we expect by function. Currently we have 3 groups that have not yet, that have bargaining agreements expiring next year. Our custodians, our maintenance, and our principals all expire at the end of this year, so we're still in the process of bargaining those. So we don't have any increases in this version tied to those. The Teachers Association is getting a 2% increase, which is the predominant increase in the instruction function minus the 13 personnel. So it is adjusted for the number of personnel that we're going to have. So the same with instruction, special education. As those numbers go up, you see a higher percentage. They're not getting that high percentage increase, but the cost of those services will go up because there'll be more FTEs.
And when you're talking about the salary inflation, you're talking purely about, you're not talking about benefit expense.
This is not. This is purely salary. We'll have a pretty much corresponding, and we have the benefits on the next slide. So those increase at about the same rate as the salary. Our medical insurance isn't going up too much. We don't have anything bargained next year to increase it. The teachers' agreement, the biggest one, has the same contributions from the district next year as it does this year. So we're not going to see an increase there.
Congratulations. We should all be so lucky.
Well, they may see a decline in benefits. That's the other side of it. We don't make and that's what we see when we make with all the rest of the folks in the district, predominantly are in our self-insured plan, and we haven't been increasing our contributions to that plan much over the years either. So we've seen reductions in just the level of benefits that we've had. This year, with the Vera Clinic, we actually made out really well. Our revenue into our health insurance fund exceeded our expenditures by a few $1 million, so we were happy about that.
So, Mr. Chairman?
Yes.
Andy, at some point, if it works with the schedule, I would actually love to have you come and give a more detailed presentation on how well that worked. I mean, it's just, 15, 20 minutes
Yeah.
just to talk about how well it worked, why you think it worked. There were a lot of naysayers out there that said that wasn't going to work. So
Right.
I'd love to know why it worked.
Our indications are that it has been working. It's really kind of hard to tell to some degree, but we have Alliant as our consultant, and they do the actuarial work for us. So they're coming up with some presentations for us to let us know why it worked. I mean, we can see a decline in the expenses into our fund, but whether that's related to just people being healthier in general, or because they're going to the clinic instead of the. We can see our usage in the clinic going up. We can see that each month.
When you know, I mean, just
Yeah,
do your business.
certainly. No, it's really an interesting concept. I've gone a few times. It's the employees, everyone that goes seems to love it. So really, we don't have a lot of increases on the benefit side. TERS and PERS increases basically along with contracts. We've kept the same level of attrition, salary attrition and benefit attrition amounts, where we have like a blanket kind of offset for vacancies within the district. We know a certain amount of people are going to be, positions will be vacant throughout the year. A certain amount of people won't claim health insurance. So we pool all that up and redistribute it, and it's somewhat akin to gambling on how much we think people aren't going to be there. We have a lot of turnover in our special education teachers assistants, and there's a 60-day wait on medical. So for lots of positions that turn over, we never pay medical out, even if they've elected it, because they'll turn over in 2 months and someone else will come in. So we see about $14 million in benefit attrition, predominantly folks waiving or not claiming or not able to take medical insurance throughout the year. So we review that every year, because that'll change with the economy. As the economy tightens up here, more people might hang on to their jobs longer and claim the health insurance if their spouse doesn't have it or something. So this is our budget gap estimate. About $9 million reduction in revenue and an increase of about almost 11 in expenditures, a little under 2%. A couple of the things that weren't on the slide that probably ought to be discussed for our costs are electricity. We're expecting to go up by about, I think, 3.5%, heat about 5%, but those have been really, really hard to predict recently. Partly because of the weather, then partly because whether the rates will actually get approved or not. We had Swan Lake fire, which destroyed some of the infrastructure down there, and they were talking about rate increases to be able to repair that. We haven't seen them come through, but we know it could be a possibility. The rent for our building is going up by about 11%. This contract was negotiated back in 2005, and every 5 years the base rate resets. So they have a kicker every 5 years, and this is one of the years that we're getting that kicker enacted.
And when does that come up for renegotiation?
We have 5 more years on the lease. So this is the last rate increase before we have to renegotiate.
So your rates are stable, and then it goes up.
Well, somewhat. So it'll reset, and then every year there's an inflationary factor on the operations and maintenance portion, which is like 35% of the rent. So we pay inflationary increases on about 35% of the rent in those off years.
As they say, you places your bets and you pays your money, right? And then 5 years from now, 3 years from now, you'll start renegotiating.
Yeah.
See what happens.
It wasn't my contract.
Did you own the building on DeBar?
No, we leased that one.
Oh, okay.
And really, when we got into that, the one on Northern Lights was quite a bit cheaper once we got in there. And JML Properties did all the remodeling. It's been a great facility for us, frankly. I don't know what we were paying before we moved in, if how that's comparable to what it is now. But we didn't own the other one. The other one is our insurance is going to go up by about 40%. It should say insurance and other on there, because we also have OSSA dues and some other just kind of non-categorical stuff, bad debt, stuff in there. But our insurance from what we adopted to next year is going to go up by it's around $400,000. It's about 40%, predominantly based on nationwide trends in traumatic head injuries and sexual abuse. So we're seeing those trends. We saw about 30% increase this year, but the board allocated some money to cover it, which is not included in that adopted budget number. So an adopted budget to next adopted budget, it'll be about a 40% increase. So, and there's really doesn't seem to be anything we can do about it. You know, it's just the cost of doing business. Our transportation fund, our revenue is predominantly from state funding. We get $481 per ADM for those. For students, that hasn't changed since 2015, I believe. For several years in there, they had it inflation protected, so our amount per student would go up by the amount of inflation. That stopped, and no one ever really addressed it. And then it got compounded when the citizens passed the initiative to increase minimum wage. Our bus drivers are required to make, at minimum, twice minimum wage. So as that keeps going up by inflation, and it was going up by like $1 every year up until it got to $9.50, and then it was up by inflation. So we're paying twice that, and their wages are inflation protected now as well, at double. So that's where we see the transportation fund. Our state transportation revenue is based on the 481. Our property taxes, we plugged that in as we can take property taxes outside of the state cap. So the state limits how much we can put into our general fund, but then we can request extra to pay for transportation, food service, some of these special revenue funds.
We can property tax up to 7.65 mils, right? And then you're saying that you can ask for more on top of that?
I don't think it's 7.65. It's 2.65 for the required, and then
That's the minimum.
and then
There's a cap, too.
the additional local equates to probably just under 2.65 because we get 107 million from the 2.65 and like 102 or 103 from the additional.
Okay, yeah, I think you're right. I think it's not as high as 2.
So it's like 5 and
Yeah,
change,
but there is a cap.
5.3 or something. There is in the general fund, yeah.
Yeah, but then you're saying that there's an additional component on top of it.
And then we can request additional funds for special revenue funds, which would be transportation or like food service.
And how much of that is in terms of a mill rate percentage? A mill?
4.5 million.
Oh, it's tiny.
Yeah, considerably less.
Yeah, it's nothing. It's like 0.01 mil or something like that.
Yeah, it's not nearly as much, but it is something new that we did for FY20 that we do for next year to keep the fund in balance essentially. And the transportation fund may have some fund balance remaining in it this year that we can use to offset that request in property taxes. And we're somewhat restricted on using that money for anything else too. So. But we are subject to the local tax cap also. So we can take the lesser of the local cap or the state cap. For the last several years, we've been under the state cap. But if we request more, it'd go up to if we get up to the local, like if there's a state initiative to up the required local contribution, then the district can't take a whole lot more than it's taking now for the local cap. But even though we'd be allowed to under state, we'd have less revenue overall, so we couldn't. So we just got to be kind of cognizant when we see those bills come through of what it does to what we can and can't actually ask the city for at that point. So we assume about $700,000 or so increase in cost for transportation, in line with inflation, somewhat for our expenses because most of our wages are in our contract with Reliant, our contracted bus service that does about 2/3 of our route. Our routes is it's inflation adjusted too. So that's our transportation fund. There's some additional information about here's where our FTE goes, predominantly into the AEA, the Teachers Association, and Totem is our admin assistants, secretaries, and teachers assistants, and then several other positions in there. But that's teachers assistants probably makes up the bulk of them. Custodial, maintenance, ACEs like professional and technical employees. It'll be mostly IT folks, accounting, HR, and then just kind of one-off positions that don't really fit in any other group. APA would be noon duty, or APA is the Principals Association. So that's kind of where our FTE are. Same thing where the money goes to these associations. And it really just tracks the number of FTE for the most part. By state function, here's where the money goes. To instruction, about $270 million. Instruction and special education, they're the primary drivers. And operations and maintenance, that includes all our custodians, maintenance, personnel, and all our utilities. So those,
sorry.
oh, go ahead.
Do you have it broken out somewhere where the like what the percent change in these categories? These categories or the prior categories was over from current year to next year? Did you break it out that way at all?
We have it on the salaries, like if that salary table had it broken down, but we don't.
Yeah.
We didn't have it aggregated.
Okay.
But we do have that on the when we prepare our actual budget. That information is all included, and it's quite a bit more detailed. But this is really just kind of the rough projection to get the budget gap. So we don't really go into as much details, like breaking out. For instance, the ACE people are in all different sorts of functions. To be able to kind of extrapolate how much that contract is going to cost by function, by account key, it's frankly more time than what I have at this point. Yeah. So and then we're doing, the board has asked for the kind of timing on ours is we started school a couple months ago, and now we're asked to be projecting how much it's going to cost for next year. And we really don't have a great handle on how much it's going to cost this year based on who we actually hired and how much students and even the state revenue, right? So we kind of wait till the last minute to actually prepare this document, and then kind of rush through it quickly to get just that budget gap, and then spend most of our time preparing the actual budget to get that more correct. This is just estimated cost by just some various types. So we spend $124 million on elementary teachers, $116 million on special education, secondary teachers. So it just gives you a little more data of how these programs are broken out. And then we have this is our timeline. Right now we're in beginning of December. Our schools and departments are submitting what they need in their budgets for next year. We're developing all the personnel costs for them, trying to engage the community. We've got surveys going out to the community, trying to get some guidance on what they think is important. We've already sent the surveys out to our principals and leadership teams at the schools. We'll meet with the different unions and try to get some input from them as well. But we anticipate having our budget done the end of January and approval to the board, the 2 meetings in February, and approval by the assembly and 2 meetings in March, and then redo it once the legislature figures out what they want to do sometime in May or June. That's our process. So that's really all we have. I don't know, I have a board room. I think we actually did this slideshow to present to the board, and they didn't want a slideshow. So we have board member comments in here as a slide. So if you guys have any comments or suggestions, let us know. And that is it for our pro forma budget.
So you have the slide, Andy, that showed the projected growing gap between expenses and revenues.
Yes.
Can you say more? What's the overall driver of that? That seems pretty concerning to me.
Let's see. It's back to this one.
Yeah.
So it's predominantly inflation. So the red line going up is our expenditure trends based on about 2% inflation. And then our revenue is based on enrollment and then flat funding. So if we were to get increases in the BSA or even money outside the BSA, that gap would go away. If it's outside the BSA, then you see the green line shoot up and then right back down if it's not. If it's just one-time money.
You know, think one of the things that you're really seeing there is, the state has not inflation adjusted the BSA in a really long time. And
So that's
I'm doing a project for a client right now, and the state's actually spending on an inflation adjusted basis is spending 10% less money in terms of purchasing power than it was spending a decade ago just on education. And so I think you're finally seeing that bite into districts, and that's what's causing this wedge. If you flat fund everything without it, right? I mean, prices don't flat fund.
So
They go up.
the BSA is adjusted, in terms of inflation adjustment, it's just done like periodically sometimes when the legislature devotes attention to, there's no formula to increase it automatically.
Right.
So,
It has to be reauthorized every year the way it's set up. Even the years that they've done, they put it in. I think twice since in the last 13 years that I've been at the district, they've put in like multi-year increases. Governor Palin did it, and then I guess she was the most recent one that did it in, was it 13, 14, 15?
Yeah, they're more likely, it seems like in recent years is what they'll do is they'll do what they did 2 years ago is they'll chuck $20 or $30 million towards the system for a year or two and leave the BSA alone. So they continue to flat fund, but then for maybe 1 year they try to get a whole, which I think of it as the election year effect.
Right.
Right?
So if it's an election year, we make it. So.
We should say we increase funding for education, but they don't increase it as much as if you were to account for inflation.
Right, and it's not permanent, so you're
And it's
going
not
through the same
permanent.
thing every year. So it seems like they could do a better system of planning. If they could even just do 2 years at a time, say so we know what our budget is. It'd at least save me the trouble of doing 2 budgets, or 3, or however many I end up having to do. But yeah, that's the basis of this is not having any sort of increase in the BSA or other outside money coming in, and then our costs continue to escalate. What we see every year is this baseline, it resets because we make the cuts, get down to our revenue targets, and it goes back up again. The back page of the memo has a 6-year kind of outlook on it, and it has some has 5 years of history on it too. So you can see the cuts that we have been making since 2016. So it goes down. Since then, we've cut 260 positions since 2016. $20 million gap, that's about 217, 220 positions based on average wages. For the purpose of this model, we have it equal increments reduction across all functions, knowing that's probably not what would happen. You don't want to behold administrations to this kind of singularity in the document, but it's just kind of gives you a picture of the scope of what could happen when prices keep going up and then you don't get any more revenue.
And so closing the gap, because we're talking about a significant gap for the coming year, and then it's going to continue likely. What that means? That means laying off teachers. That means ultimately at a certain point closing schools, or it could.
Possibly, yeah.
Down the road.
Closing schools takes a lot of time,
But
and
like down the road,
rebounding,
right?
and so I don't know that'll happen this year. That they'll make any closures unless they come to some agreement out in Eagle River based on the earthquake damaged schools. I don't think there's going to be any talk of actually closing them for next year because I don't know if there's time enough to get the community support and all the rebounding that needs to happen.
The other thing is Mr. Chairman, is that even though we now have the hold harmless provision for closing schools, we have to remember that when you close a school, you put kids into the remaining schools, which makes the schools bigger, which means that you get less money under the funding formula. So you really need to be confident that closing that school is going to actually save you money, because the net may be that you just put kids in bigger schools and get less money from the state.
And after the hold harmless expires, generally you're losing money in that situation. So that's kind of why it wasn't done in the past, because you made more money in revenue than you would get by reducing a principal, a nurse, a librarian, and some custodial staff. because that's really reducing the supplies, and the teachers all follow the students. And then you save on the capital cost, so you're likely trying to close the schools that need the most work. Which brings us to our bonds. I don't know if we have any time left.
Yeah, we have a couple minutes.
All right, so I'm less well versed on the bonds, so it should go quicker. I don't have a slide for it. But the memo is what the board passed. It was largely the same as the administration had asked for, with the addition of Aquarian Charter School at $6.8 million. $42.5 million of that is for earthquake recovery out at Bruning and Eagle River schools. Some of that money may be FEMA reimbursable, so we may get a chunk of that $42 million back after we've spent it. At which point we may want to engage this body again and discuss, because when that money comes back, there's essentially not a lot of strings attached to it. It's you could use it to pay debt, a 1-year reprieve in property taxes. You could use it for new projects and not ask for bond money. There's a lot of different things you could do with it, and it might be up to this, have this body make a recommendation on what the district should do. I believe the board tried to make some amendments to say, if the money were to come back, then it would go towards lowering property taxes for a year. So I don't know. Nothing really got sorted out on that front. But it is a decision they're going to have to make. If the bond passes, we spend all this money, and then we get the FEMA reimbursement.
All right, so I think in the interest of time, does anyone have any quick questions on the bonds yet?
So I was curious, was there any conversation, and I don't know if schools do this, having the Aquarian project be a separate bond?
There was.
Because I looked at that, and that was my first
conversation.
thought, is like, oh, it's such a controversial topic. I would hate to see everything else not get funded.
Yeah, I mean, they did talk about separating out into multiple bonds this year, but ultimately they decided to just put it into one.
And then one more question. I think over the past few years, we've seen a reduction in student enrollment drop, I want to say in the 700 student range. Is that?
The last several years, it's been almost 3,000, I believe.
Yeah,
Over the
so,
course of several years.
Over the course of several
But
years.
that 700, 800 number feels right. about
yeah,
that.
so, and I remember
And there's some
thinking
data
that
on
that
this.
was odd last year, that the budget was built on a different number than what we actually expected the reduction to be.
Oh, what do you mean?
So, like, if we're expecting that there was 800 less students, and we built the budget based on 300 less.
So there's going to be some difference between ADM and enrollment.
Mm-hmm.
And this year we did make some adjustments to our ADM, the way that we calculate that out through the state, particularly within high schools where they're doing block scheduling. Apparently the state hadn't been allowing, if we're on a block schedule, they're taking a full load, but they're only taking like two or three courses during the day or something. The state was only allowing a 0.75 for those students. So we went back, now that's not right, and we finally got some more ADM out of it.
You're still educating a whole student there, right?
Yeah. They're taking a full day of class, every day. And then, so there's a little bit of that, but predominantly our enrollment projections should match our ADM projections. Or at least be pretty close.
Thank you very much for the presentation. So there's some
If you have any questions, you're reading through it, you can always call or email.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Next up is OMB on our agenda. We are just about out of time, but we might want to go probably no more than like 5 to 7 minutes if we can to wrap up a couple things. But from an OMB perspective, do you have anything that you want to update us on?
I think Assemblymember Dunbar did an excellent job of recapping what occurred during the approval of the 2020 budget. The approved documents are soon going to be online on our website, and we will be proceeding then with our next bit of the budget process, the 2020 revised budget, which is where we set the taxes, and it's kind of, we work with the school district on identifying that tax need. And then also, I think the things that you'll see, and I don't know what Lance has conveyed, but fund balance, the municipality is facing kind of the same situation with fund balance and the FEMA recovery, where the CFO presented, I think in this last assembly meeting, request that our fund balance reserve is lower than our prescribed 10 and 2% because of the FEMA expectation. So it's very similar to what the school district is doing. We don't want to tax for that recovery if we're going to recover it from FEMA. But that will also probably play a part in our 2021Q budget preparation. Otherwise, I don't think there's much else from OMB at this time. Thank you.
Action item on the agenda is, next up is the selection of chair and vice chair, which I think we're actually a little bit overdue for elections. So I think I might be kind of ruling by fiat at this point, or might be kind of an illegitimate chair. So the process is to put out nominations and vote up or down on both the chair and vice chair positions. So does anybody have nominations that they would like to make?
Mr. Chairman, I have a nomination. Actually, I'd like to renominate you for the position. I feel like we've gotten a head of steam up this year, and would be served by having some consistent leadership since you've gotten this under your belt. So,
Appreciate that very much. Thank you. I accept the nomination for that. I enjoyed it. Is there a second? And are there other nominations that is anyone else interested in chair? Or being nominated? Does anyone know if we need to do both chair and vice chair together, like procedurally, before putting it to a vote? Is that a thing?
I can look into it. I don't know.
you put them in independently.
So independently? Okay.
Yep.
Well then, I guess it goes to a vote for chair. And in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Thank you very much. I did not for a chance to
Oh, let's back up. I might change my mind.
I could do like a nice 3-hour oration or something like that. I really do appreciate the chance to be chair. It's definitely something that I'm really enjoying. It's a lot of fun, and I do think hopefully that we're getting some momentum going. And so I really do value this role a lot and the chance to work with this group. So thank you both very much. And then for vice chair. Currently Alyssa is serving as vice chair. Do we have nominations that anyone wants to put forth?
I'll renominate Alyssa if she's willing to accept.
Yeah, thank you.
I would second that. Any other nominations?
Start your speech.
Just kidding. It was very long. I'll spare you all.
All right, then, up or down vote. All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposition? Well, that was fairly painless then.
Thank you.
Congratulations.
Appreciate it.
Because the rest of us are going, suck
Alyssa's done an awesome job at being vice chair, by the way, too, standing in for me at times for both this meeting and for going to the assembly work sessions. And so that's been a really good thing. Yes.
So before we wrap up, what happened to our resolution? Did it not pass?
Sorry, which resolution are you talking about? Our budget
Yeah.
resolution?
Yeah.
Oh, it did pass.
Oh.
Yeah. Sorry, it did pass, and it went to the assembly in advance of the meeting on the budget vote. The budget on the 19th when the budget vote is. So yes, it did go through.
Okay.
Yeah, I had at least one assembly member The other a couple of like final wrap-up items. We do have a work session scheduled for Monday the 16th. Optional work session. The topic there is revenue options. There are several revenue options that are kind of floating around that might be put forth for the April ballot proposition. So there's discussion of a few different things like potential sales tax, bed tax changes. There's also this kind of special purpose sales tax idea, that Project 20's concept. The Assembly's putting a lot of effort into these, and the administration's thinking really hard about these. I don't know what their thinking is exactly as far as what they want to back. It seems like it's, from talking to Ona Browse, Chief of Staff, they're still in the decision process on that. And so our input can influence that direction, and so there's some really important subjects to discuss there. And so if, certainly would appreciate folks that can come into that session on the 16th. And then, of course, we have our strategy session sometime in January. I think we still have to nail down the date. Otherwise, I think we're probably wrapped up. Is there a motion to adjourn?
Motion to adjourn.
Second.
All right. Any opposition to that? Thank you.